everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are tackling something pretty interesting. It's a transcript of one of Donald Trump's addresses to Congress.
Fifth one, actually.
Oh, right, his fifth one. Now, we don't have an exact date on this one, but it was uploaded to YouTube by FOX5 New York, and let me tell you, this thing is a beast. It's long and packed with detail.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one.
So our mission today is to pull out the key themes, the really attention-grabbing moments, and just give you a good overall sense of what exactly Trump is trying to get across here.
I think it's really fascinating that we are dealing with a YouTube upload from a specific news outlet like that. Already tells us a little something about how this speech is going to be framed and who the target audience might be right off the bat.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of framing, one of the first things that jumps out is how much he focuses on the economy. Like, it's almost like a victory lap right out of the gate.
He really doesn't waste any time, does he?
Yeah.
He dives right into this whole booming economy thing, boasting about all that his administration achieved in just their first 43 days.
Right.
He even claims that it surpasses what other administrations accomplished in years. He throws out lines like, "The American dream is unstoppable," and "Our country is about to witness a comeback, the likes of which the world has never seen."
It's a lot of really strong claims, and he doesn't hold back on some pretty bold statistics either.
Oh, yeah. He mentions things like achieving record-low illegal border crossings, having the biggest popular vote win, and even cites a 27-point swing in the number of Americans who now believe that the country is headed in the right direction.
But I noticed something kind of interesting here. That there's a lot of these bold pronouncements, right? Huge claims. But he's a little light on the specifics, wouldn't you say?
That's a great observation, and it's something to keep in mind as we dig deeper. I mean, he uses a ton of superlatives,
Yeah.
right? Like these grand, sweeping statements, but he doesn't always back them up with a lot of hard evidence.
It's almost like, believe me, it's great, but without the nitty-gritty details. So I wonder, is that part of the strategy? Like appealing to emotion rather than, getting bogged down in the weeds with the numbers?
It could be. I mean, it can definitely be a really effective way to connect with an audience, especially one that's already kind of inclined to agree with you.
Right, right.
But it also raises questions about, how valid his claims actually are and if they'd hold up to, like, serious scrutiny.
For sure, for sure. That's definitely something for all of you listening to think about as we go along. So, okay, moving on. Another theme that pops up constantly is this idea of common sense. It's like his go-to framing for just about every policy.
Yeah, he's always casting himself as this champion of practicality.
Yeah.
Cutting through the red tape, undoing all the supposedly nonsensical stuff that past administrations did.
And he rattles off a whole bunch of examples, right? Like freezing federal hiring, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, ditching the WHO,
Yeah.
getting rid of environmental regulations, forcing federal workers to come back to the office. I mean, it's almost like he's trying to paint this picture of the government as this giant out-of-control machine that's totally lost touch with, like, everyday reality.
And by positioning himself as the antidote,
Yeah.
the guy who's going to fix it all, he's tapping into something that's really powerful. I mean,
Right.
people are often drawn to these simple solutions,
Yeah.
just wanting things to make sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he's saying, look, I'm just a regular guy who sees things for what they are, and I'm going to come in and fix this mess. It's a pretty potent message, especially when you pair it with that emotional appeal we talked about earlier.
It definitely is. And it can be really effective with audiences who are already skeptical of the government or who feel like this system is working against them.
Okay, well, buckle up, because things get really interesting when he starts talking about social issues. He does not shy away from those hot-button topics, does he?
Oh, no, not at all.
This is where he really digs into those core beliefs, and tries to energize that specific base.
For sure.
So just to give you a taste, he talks about making English the official language, renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, banning DEI initiatives,
Wow.
denouncing critical race theory, declaring that there are only two genders, and wants to ban transgender women from competing in women's sports. It's quite a set of proposals, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's not just like what he's proposing, it's how he presents it too.
Yeah.
These are all issues that carry this huge emotional charge. They're meant to tap into people's deeply held values and anxieties.
Yeah, and he does it really effectively. Like, for example, he tells this story about Peyton McNabb. She's a high school athlete who suffered a brain injury when another athlete, allegedly transgender, hit a volleyball into her face. By putting a human face on these issues, it creates this much more visceral connection with the audience.
It's classic storytelling, and it could be incredibly persuasive. Whether the facts always line up with the narrative is a different story, but the emotional impact is undeniable.
Okay, so next up, we've got the segment on government spending, and this is where things start to get a little wild.
Oh, yeah, he launches into this almost comedic rant about all these wasteful government programs. It's like
Mhm.
he's trying to paint this picture of the government as this frivolous, out-of-touch entity that's just throwing money around with no regard.
He brings up all these crazy sounding initiatives like making mice transgender. I mean,
Yes.
honest, where does he even come up with this stuff?
Who knows? But it's definitely effective in creating this sense of outrage
No.
and tapping into that populist sentiment of draining the swamp.
And then, right in the middle of this whole rant about wasteful spending, he throws out this completely unexpected solution, the gold card.
What?
Yeah, basically, it's like a $5 million fast track to U.S. citizenship for wealthy foreigners.
Talk about a jarring juxtaposition. On the one hand, he's railing against wasteful spending, and on the other, he's proposing a program that seems to benefit, the wealthy elite.
Right. It's
Yeah.
like, we got to cut back on all these wasteful programs, but hey, if you're rich, come on in. I don't know. It's a little confusing. What do you make of it?
It's definitely an interesting move, and it raises some questions about his overall economic philosophy.
Oh.
Is he really this populist fighting for the little guy, or is he more interested in catering to the wealthy and powerful? Hard to
Oh,
say.
yeah. It's a good question, and it's definitely something for all of you listening to think about. So, okay, let's move on to his actual economic proposals. And these are really centered around two main things, tax cuts and tariffs.
Two of his favorite topics.
Oh, yeah. He's been a big proponent of both of those for a long time, and he really doubles down on them here. He wants to cut taxes on things like tips, overtime, even Social Security benefits, and he also talks about incentivizing the production of American-made cars.
Interesting.
And then there's his reciprocal tariff policy, which is basically his way of saying, if you hit us with tariffs, we're hitting you right back. He spends a lot of time explaining this, so it seems like it's something he's really passionate about.
Yeah, he sees it as a way to protect American industries from what he perceives as unfair competition,
Yeah.
making sure that other countries don't take advantage of us.
Yeah, it's all about putting America first right. But I can't help but wonder about the potential downsides. I mean, could this lead to trade wars and actually end up hurting the economy in the long run?
Those are valid concerns. I mean, tariffs are a complex issue, and there's a lot of debate about their effectiveness. They can definitely protect certain industries in the short term, but they can also lead to higher prices for consumers and retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which can ultimately hurt everyone involved.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. All right, let's move on to a topic that always seems to get people fired up, border security and law and order. And let me tell you, this is where we see Trump at his most fiery.
Yeah, he uses incredibly strong language here, talking about cracking down on immigration and claiming that he's achieved these record low illegal crossings. He paints a very stark picture of the dangers posed by criminals and gangs entering the country illegally.
And he really doesn't shy away from using fear as a motivator.
Not at all.
He shares these really emotional anecdotes about victims of crimes committed by illegal immigrants, for instance. He tells the story of Laken Riley, a nursing student who was tragically murdered by an undocumented immigrant who already had a criminal record. It's incredibly powerful stuff, and it's clearly designed to evoke a very specific reaction.
It's a classic appeal to fear and security, you know? By highlighting these tragic stories, he's trying to justify increased border security funding and these stricter law enforcement measures.
Right, it's like he's saying, look, this is a real problem, and we need to take drastic action to protect ourselves. But it's also important to remember that these anecdotes, while heartbreaking, don't necessarily represent the full picture.
That's true. They can be very persuasive,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not always representative of the broader issues of immigration or crime. It's crucial to look at the data, the statistics, and to consider the larger context.
And to remember that every story has two sides. Okay, so after this really intense segment on border security, he shifts gears a little bit and starts talking about protecting children. This is a theme that comes up quite a bit in his speeches, and it always seems to resonate with audiences.
Yeah, it's a powerful rhetorical tool, and he uses it to address a whole range of issues.
Right, we saw it with the border security discussion, and now he brings it up again this time, talking about the rising child cancer rates and linking those to environmental factors. Then he brings up transgender ideology in schools, highlighting the story of January Littlejohn, a mom whose daughter was supposedly socially transitioned at school without her knowledge or consent. It's like he's trying to tap into those parental anxieties about what's going on in schools.
He's positioning himself as this defender of children against these perceived threats, whether it's from the environment, from radical ideologies, or from, criminals crossing the border.
And it's a pretty effective strategy because who doesn't want to protect children? But it also raises some questions about whether he's oversimplifying complex issues and playing on people's fears.
Yeah, that's definitely something to consider, and it's important to remember that there are a lot of different perspectives on these issues and that there's rarely a simple solution.
All right, so next up, he turns his attention to the military and foreign policy. And no surprise here, he's all about strength and American dominance.
Yeah, he calls for increased military spending, talks about creating this Golden Dome missile defense shield, and even mentions reviving American shipbuilding.
Wow, he's not messing around. He also lays out some pretty bold foreign policy goals, things like reclaiming the Panama Canal, supporting Greenland's potential integration with the U.S., and resolving the conflict in Ukraine. These are some pretty big swings, and they definitely fit with his America First worldview.
They do, and they really reflect his very assertive approach to foreign policy.
Hmm.
You know, he's not afraid to challenge the status quo or to act unilaterally, even if it means going against international consensus. Yeah.
So to sum it up, he wants a strong military American dominance on the world stage, and he's not afraid to take a very aggressive approach to achieving those goals.
That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, the use of anecdotes in political speeches. We've seen a lot of that in this speech, haven't we?
Oh, yeah, tons of it. Stories about Peyton McNabb, Laken Riley, January Littlejohn. It's like he's got a story for every single point he wants to make.
And that's no coincidence. Stories are incredibly powerful. They put a human face on these complex issues, and they can evoke really strong emotional responses.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear those stories, it's hard not to be moved, but I think it's important to remember that anecdotes aren't evidence. They can be cherry-picked to support a particular narrative, and they don't always represent the whole picture.
Absolutely. It's crucial to be aware of the emotional impact of these stories, but it's just as important to look for the data, to examine the evidence, and consider all sides of the issue.
It's all about critical thinking, right? We need to be able to separate the emotional appeal from the factual substance.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons we do this deep dive.
Yeah.
We want to help you develop those critical thinking skills so you can navigate the complexities of political discourse and form your own informed opinions.
So with that in mind, let's talk about his proposed solution to government waste, the gold card. This one really threw me for a loop.
It's a fascinating proposal, and one that seems to contradict a lot of his populist rhetoric.
Right. On the one hand, he's railing against government waste, and then he proposes selling U.S. citizenship to wealthy foreigners for $5 million each.
It definitely raises some questions about his true economic philosophy and who he sees as the beneficiaries of his policies. Is he really a champion of the working class as he claims, or is he more interested in helping the wealthy elite?
It's a good question, and one that I think is worth exploring further. It speaks to the complexities of his persona and his political platform. He's able to appeal to both populist and elitist sentiments, often in the same breath.
It's a testament to his skill as a communicator and his ability to tap into a wide range of anxieties and aspirations.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more theme that runs throughout this speech, the idea of America as a nation under siege.
Yeah, that's a powerful and pervasive thread. He paints this picture of America facing all these threats, both from within and from outside forces, illegal immigration, criminal gangs, toxic ideologies in schools, even globalism undermining American sovereignty.
He uses this really vivid imagery and strong language to evoke this sense of danger and urgency. He talks about needing to reclaim our sovereignty, to drain the swamp, and to wage war on the cartels.
This kind of rhetoric is designed to create this us versus them mentality, like a battle between good and evil. It's a powerful way to rally support and to justify these aggressive policies.
And it plays on this very primal fear, the fear of losing what we hold dear. Whether it's our safety, our values, or our way of life, we're all susceptible to this kind of fear-based messaging.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these rhetorical strategies and to critically evaluate the claims being made. We need to ask ourselves, is the threat as dire as it's being portrayed? Are the proposed solutions effective and just? Are there other perspectives that are being ignored or silenced?
It's all about asking the right questions and doing our own research. We can't just blindly accept what we're told, especially when it comes to these really emotionally charged issues.
Absolutely. We need to be informed, engaged, and we need to be critical thinkers. And that's what this deep dive is all about, empowering you to navigate the complex world of political discourse and form your own informed opinions.
We've covered a lot of ground already, and we're just getting started. We'll be back in part 2 to dig even deeper into Trump's vision for America and explore its implications. Stay tuned.
See you there. Welcome back to our deep dive. As we keep going through this speech, I'm struck by how often Trump talks about protecting children. It's woven into so many different parts of his speech, almost like a unifying theme.
It's everywhere, right? We saw it with border security then, with the rising child cancer rates, and of course with his stance on transgender ideology in schools. It's like he's found this common ground, this emotional core that ties all these seemingly unrelated issues together.
Exactly. And by framing it all through this lens of protecting children, he's tapping into something really powerful. It creates this sense of moral urgency and allows him to position himself as this defender of innocence and, traditional family values.
It's almost like he's saying, if you care about children, you got to support these policies. Pretty persuasive tactic, I have to admit. But I do wonder if it's also a way to kind of oversimplify these really complex issues and avoid engaging with like the nuances.
That's a really good point, and it's definitely something for all of you listening to think about too. Are these issues being presented in their full complexity, or are we just seeing certain aspects highlighted while others get downplayed?
So let's take a closer look at one specific example. He uses the story of January Littlejohn. This is the mother whose daughter was supposedly socially transitioned at school without her consent. This story really hit home for a lot of people, and it tapped into a lot of anxieties about parental rights and the role of schools in kids' lives.
Yeah, it definitely did. And it speaks to this larger trend of parental concern about what they see as this growing disconnect between their values and what's being taught in schools. This feeling that schools are overstepping their bounds and kind of imposing certain ideologies on children without parental consent.
So, by telling the story and positioning himself as this advocate for parental control, Trump's really aligning himself with a segment of the population that feels increasingly alienated by what they see as this rapidly changing culture.
Precisely, he's offering them reassurance, a sense that he understands their concerns and that he's fighting for their values.
It's interesting how he connects this idea of protecting children to his broader message of common sense, which is another theme that comes up again and again in the speech.
Oh yeah, that phrase pops up constantly, almost like a mantra.
Right.
And by using it so much, he's implicitly framing any opposing viewpoints as, nonsensical or out of touch with reality.
It's a clever way to simplify those complex issues and appeal to that desire for straightforward solutions that a lot of people have.
Exactly. He's making himself out to be the voice of reason, the one who can cut through all the noise and deliver practical solutions that resonate with everyday Americans.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about his foreign policy vision. He lays out a pretty ambitious agenda, to say the least.
He does, from taking back the Panama Canal to potentially bringing Greenland into the U.S. to resolving the conflict in Ukraine. He's thinking big and throwing out some bold proposals.
Yeah, it's definitely an America First approach, very focused on asserting American strength and sovereignty on the world stage. And he seems perfectly willing to take unilateral action, even if it means going against what the international community thinks.
Absolutely. He's not shy about challenging the status quo or using strong language to get his message across. And let's not forget his call for increased military spending and the creation of a Golden Dome missile defense shield.
It's clear that he believes in projecting American power and taking a very assertive stance in international affairs.
For sure. It's interesting, though, how this assertive foreign policy approach seems to contrast with his stance on trade, which is much more protectionist and, focused on putting American interests first.
Yeah, there's a bit of a contradiction there, isn't there?
Okay.
He wants to engage with the world, but on his own terms, and he also wants to protect American businesses and workers from what he sees as unfair competition.
It's a tough balancing act, and it reflects a worldview that's both inward-looking and outward-facing, focused on both strength and security.
I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, the use of anecdotes in political speeches. We've seen so many in this speech alone. It's worth taking a closer look at how those stories function within the broader narrative.
Definitely, we've talked about the stories of Peyton McNabb, Laken Riley, and January Littlejohn, but there are so many others throughout the speech, and they all serve a similar purpose, to put a human face on these complex issues and to really tug at your heartstrings.
It's one thing to talk about abstract concepts like illegal immigration or transgender ideology, but it's another thing entirely to hear the personal stories of people who've been affected by these issues. It creates a much deeper connection.
For sure, and it can be so persuasive because it bypasses the rational mind. It goes straight for the heart.
But as we said before, anecdotes aren't evidence. They can be carefully chosen to support a particular narrative, and they don't always represent the full picture.
That's so important to remember. Those stories, while powerful, are just one piece of the puzzle. You have to look at the broader context, the data, and the different perspectives out there.
So, in other words, don't let the emotional appeal of a story cloud your judgment or prevent you from thinking critically.
Exactly. Now let's zoom in on one of the most surprising and controversial proposals in this whole speech, the gold card.
Ah, yes. This is the one where he essentially proposes selling U.S. citizenship to wealthy foreigners for $5 million a pop, right?
That's the one. And it's fascinating because it seems to contradict so much of his populist rhetoric.
Right. He spends a good chunk of the speech railing against government waste, and then he suggests this program that seems to benefit, the wealthy elite.
It's a really curious juxtaposition, and it raises some interesting questions about his economic philosophy
Hmm.
and who he sees as the true beneficiaries of his policies. Is he really a champion of the working class like he claims, or is he more interested in catering to the wealthy and powerful?
It's a question worth pondering for sure, and it speaks to the complexities of his persona and his political platform. He's able to appeal to both populist and elitist sentiments, often in the same breath.
It's really a testament to his skill as a communicator and his ability to tap into a wide range of anxieties and aspirations.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more theme that pops up throughout the speech, the idea of America as a nation under siege.
Yeah, that's a powerful and pervasive theme. He paints this picture of America facing threats from all sides, from illegal immigration and criminal gangs to toxic ideologies in schools and the forces of globalism trying to undermine American sovereignty.
He uses this really vivid imagery and strong language to create this sense of danger and urgency. He talks about reclaiming our sovereignty, draining the swamp, and waging war on the cartels.
This kind of rhetoric is designed to create this us versus them mentality, like we're in a battle between good and evil. It's a powerful way to rally support and justify aggressive policies.
And it plays on a very primal fear.
Mhm.
The fear of losing what we hold dear, whether it's our safety, our values, or our way of life. We're all susceptible to this kind of fear-based messaging.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these rhetorical strategies and to critically evaluate the claims being made. We need to ask ourselves, is the threat as dire as it's being made out to be? Are the proposed solutions effective and just? Are there other perspectives that are being ignored or silenced?
It all comes down to asking the right questions and doing your own research. We can't just blindly accept what we're told, especially when it comes to these really emotionally charged issues.
Absolutely. We need to be informed, we need to be engaged, and we need to be critical thinkers, and that's what this deep dive is all about, empowering you to navigate the complex world of political discourse and form your own informed opinions.
So, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, keep those questions in mind. We'll be exploring more of Trump's vision for America, analyzing his rhetoric, and unpacking the implications of his proposals. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've talked about the economy, social issues, foreign policy, quite a whirlwind, right? But there's one more aspect of this speech that I think we need to unpack a bit, his use of humor and storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a huge part of how he communicates, and I think a big reason why he connects so well with certain audiences, he's got this knack for using humor to make even complex or controversial topics seem relatable, you know?
Remember that part where he goes on this whole rant about government waste? I mean, it's hilarious. He's talking about these ridiculous projects like making mice transgender. Where does he even come up with this stuff?
It's brilliant satire, really. He takes these stereotypes and just blows them way out of proportion, creating this sense of outrage. Yeah. That's also incredibly funny. And it plays right into that deep-seated distrust of government bureaucracy that a lot of people have.
Right. It's like, look how ridiculous this is. We
Right.
got to drain the swamp. And people love it.
And it's not just the humor. It's how he weaves in those personal anecdotes, those stories about everyday Americans to illustrate his points.
Oh, yeah, like the story of Jeff Denard, the steelworker from Alabama who says he's been able to support his family and even foster kids thanks to Trump's tariffs. It's a really heartwarming story.
Exactly. And then there's the story of DJ Daniel, this 13-year-old cancer survivor who wants to be a police officer.
Mm.
Trump makes him an honorary Secret Service agent right there on stage. It's a really touching moment, and it shows how skilled he is at connecting with people on an emotional level.
And these stories aren't just random. They're carefully chosen to evoke very specific emotions. You know, pride, patriotism, hope, sympathy. It's all part of creating this sense of shared identity and making himself seem more relatable, more human.
It's Storytelling 101, really.
Mm.
He uses these narratives to ground those abstract concepts,
Mm.
make them concrete, and give them this emotional weight. And it works. People remember stories, they connect with them, and they're just more likely to be persuaded by a message when it's wrapped up in a good story.
But while we can acknowledge his skills as a communicator, I think it's important to also acknowledge that his style can be very polarizing, you know?
Oh, for sure. I mean, his humor can definitely be off-putting, even
Yeah.
offensive to some. And his tendency to make these sweeping generalizations and attack his opponents,
Yeah.
well, it can create a pretty hostile and divided atmosphere.
Yeah, his style thrives on conflict. He's not afraid to pick fights, and he seems to enjoy that role of the outsider,
Right.
the rebel who's shaking things up.
Right. And that can be really appealing to some, especially those who feel like the system is rigged against them and they need someone who's not afraid to fight for them. But it can also alienate others who prefer a more, measured and respectful approach.
So, as you listen to this speech and think about its impact, keep in mind that his style is this double-edged sword. It can be incredibly effective at rallying support, but it can also be very divisive.
Exactly. Now I think it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. We've spent a lot of time breaking down the individual pieces, but what does it all add up to? What's the big message that Trump's trying to get across?
Well, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I'd say he's painting a picture of America as a nation that's been knocked down but is ready to get back up, and reclaim its spot at the top.
It's his appeal to nostalgia, right? A yearning for this time when America was seen as stronger, wealthier, more respected on the world stage.
Yeah, and he's promising to bring that back, to make America great again. And that's a powerful message, especially for people who feel like they've been left behind or forgotten by the system.
Exactly.
She's offering them hope, a vision of a future where America is once again a dominant force. And he does it by tapping into a whole spectrum of emotions: fear, anger, pride, patriotism.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a few things to think about. What do you make of Trump's vision for America? Does it resonate with you? Do you find it inspiring, concerning, or maybe a little bit of both?
And just as important, how do you think his rhetoric, his use of storytelling and emotional appeals shapes how we view these complex issues? We encourage you to keep digging into this speech and to have those thoughtful conversations about what it means for American politics and society.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating look at some of today's most pressing topics. Until then, keep those critical thinking skills sharp and stay curious.